Welcome to another episode of the Sage Holistic Show. My name is Emily Sellis, and I'm your host. I am so excited to be bringing to you one of our very own holistic healers of Orange County. This is a group of holistic professionals here in Orange County where we meet together monthly to build the community up, to build relationships with one another, and to learn about different healing modalities so that we can refer our clients where they need to go for their healing journey. Today, you're going to be hearing from Deanna Holloway, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Orange County, and she's going to be presenting on working with the sexual trauma body using somatic psychotherapy. We really look forward to having you learn something here so that you can follow that inner prompting that you have towards your path of healing. Sage is a 501c3 nonprofit organization building community by providing education and counseling about physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We encourage all of our listeners to find their own path to what holistic wellness means to you.
So guys, before I get started in talking, right, I think I'd like us all to kind of get in our bodies, right? So I invite you to take a moment and stretch. I invite you to take a moment and wiggle around. I invite you to take a moment and breathe. You can make noise. You can do it softly. You can find it in your body. Just notice yourself sitting here, right? And then I want you to take a moment and I want you to look around your room that you're sitting in. I want you to notice textures, colors, shapes, objects, maybe seeing things for the first time or remembering, oh, that's where I put that, right? So part of the work I do as a somatic psychotherapist is to bring people back in, right? To bring you down into the body. And I have an interesting story about how and why I became a somatic psychotherapist, which I will get into. But let me start my little presentation. Can everybody see it? Yes, good. So how I came to be a somatic psychotherapist and a licensed marriage and family therapist. It was an interesting journey. It came through my pole dancing class. Yes, that's when I realized that all of my trauma was in the tissues, right? I think Bonnie said that earlier. All the issues are in the tissues, right? I found emotion, I found pain, I found joy, I found trauma, I found anger, I found all of this stuff that I had learned through life to keep in this well-contained, very aligned, perfectionistic, executive living experience, right? I'd done therapy since I was 18, but I didn't know that there was all this stuff that I was carrying around, right? And so getting into the body, getting into the movement, getting into the present moment of being me allowed me to start to peel away these layers. So as this is my second career. I was an HR executive for almost 20 years before becoming a licensed marriage and family therapist. Some would say I did therapy for 20 years for people in business, which is pretty much what I did. But also, I did a lot of exploration of self. I've done yoga. I've trained to be a yoga teacher. I've done Reiki. I've done energy channel healing. I've done hypnosis. I've done TRE. I've done erotic movement. I've done Feldenkrais. I've done done it all, right? And one of the things that I found as in going through my journey and in not understanding or not having a therapist who understood what I was holding on to was that oftentimes these modalities didn't provide me relief, right? Oftentimes I would either get re-traumatized, re-triggered. I would have a fibromyalgia attack after an acupuncture session. I would have a major collapse in my system after doing EMDR. I'm like, I couldn't understand. My head couldn't understand what was happening, right? And that's because these two pieces of myself are not connected. The head and the body did not know what was going on. I lived completely up here and not down in here, right? So that's a little bit about my journey. I do suffer from complex PTSD as a result of sexual trauma. I'm pretty open with my clients about that as well. That is a big part of my journey that brought me here to be who I am and how I work with people. Am I complex PTSD? No. Is a part of me have complex PTSD? Yes, but thankfully not all of me, as I've learned in working with all these holistic people, right? So I'm here today to say that I want to meet people to kind of start becoming part of my collective that are trauma informed or trauma trained, so we can start to expand this holistic way of dealing with people, because I had benefits sometimes from acupuncture, sometimes from EMDR, sometimes from somatic experiencing, sometimes from hypnosis, but not always. And I would have to go back and forth in between the therapeutic world and what I call the adjunct therapy world, right? And that's okay, right? We all need to be a village, not little pillars of isolation, right? Because each person is complex. Each person has their own history. Bonnie was talking today is like, sometimes in the pain in the hip means someone can't move forward. Well, sometimes pain in the hip means someone was keeping them pinned down, right? We don't know because we didn't live that experience with the person. So I want to talk a little bit about where I've made some mistakes as a therapist, because I may have made a lot of them. I've made people throw up. I've made people, collapse. I've made people panic. I mean, that's part of working with the body, is that we do have a tendency to tap into these things pretty strongly, right? So the focus today is to talk about my journey, talk about how holistic therapists and holistic modalities can also support people, especially with sexual trauma and complex PTSD. And we'll just go from there. I've been sitting on one slide forever. So I want to tell you a little bit about me. Who am I? First off, I am a dancer, I'm a photographer, I'm a partner, I'm a mother, I'm a friend, I'm an intuitive. And more often than not, I'm bluntly honest, right? That's who I am. I do somatic trauma psychotherapy, but that's not what I am, right? So when I show up in the room with my clients, I don't have that therapist suit on. I don't have that therapist kind of nod and, oh, tell me more. I'm kind of one of those, let's just get down to brass tacks and talk about the shit you're feeling right now, right? So my focus in working with women right now, and this is what I've defined as my niche, is to help them find their ways back to their bodies after sexual trauma. This includes non-consenting sex. This happens in relationships, this happens in marriages. And what it amounts to essentially is rape, right? And it's something that the sexual trauma world is starting to recognize, that women who are in non-consenting sexual relationships don't have choices to say yes or no, even if they're able-bodied people, because either there's domestic violence involved, emotional abuse, some sort of tie to danger or potential harm to their children, right? And this can go on for years, right? I have people who come in who've been sexually shamed, who are in the midst of changing religions or letting go of cultural expectations from a sexual perspective. And believe it or not, more than 80% of the people or the women that I have seen from a sexual perspective have have experienced at some point some form of incest, right? And so this adds another layer on top of it. The next layer is then attachment trauma, right? So we've got attachment trauma on top of sexual trauma. It's really, really difficult. And then also I work with people who are in their space of sexual exploration and awakenings, whether they're getting into the BDSM community, whether they're looking at polyamory, whether they're looking at maybe exploring same-sex relationships when they've only been, exploring same-sex, different gender orientations, all those types of things, right? So that's kind of the umbrella that my work falls under. I graduated from Pacifica Graduate Institute in depth psychology. I have been trained in working with this fabulous mentor, Wendy Elliott, who's amazing. And if anybody's an LMFT who wants to do a body-based program, she has her own body-based program that combines Hakomi, mindfulness, authentic movement, dance, trauma, depth. It's just beautiful. And right now I'm completing my certification in somatic erotic education. And I've done level 1 training in IFS, which is parts work for trauma, which is really beautiful. So let's talk a little bit the difference between simple PTSD and complex PTSD. Simple PTSD is a single event, like a car accident, one assault, one issue, one argument, one of something, right? But complex PTSD is prolonged trauma, typically developmental trauma, may even be layered trauma from birth trauma to pre-verbal trauma to abuse as a child, right? And then also we're dealing with now, as we need to bring into the forefront, is cultural and racial systems that have created layers and generations of trauma, right? Studies are finding that Black Americans are living in PTSD just by nature of being born, right? Their systems are already set up that way. Their nervous system is already set up that way. That's really challenging. And often complex PTSD is misdiagnosed. Oftentimes, because of the highs and the lows that the person goes through, the psychiatrist will label them bipolar 2 or bipolar. They live forever thinking that there's something chemically wrong with them, when actuality, it might just be layered trauma. Okay. So this is my trauma tree. And the reason why I bring this up is because I want to really kind of help you see how trauma can affect this adult that walks in your room, right? It can start at the roots, the prenatal part. It can start at birth. It could have been a complicated birth trauma, right? That they have no memory of. They could have been pulled out by forceps and wonder why they're petrified at the idea of forcefulness, right? Infancy and toddler, they could experience all sorts of things. So depending on where the trauma hits on their tree, when you see them as an adult, right, that little leaf that they're bringing into your room has a long history, super long history, typically that goes all the way down into the roots of their being, right? All the way down into their body, right? For some people, there's fortunate things that happen where they have great caregiver support, they have therapy, they have community, they're already involved in adjunct modalities that support them and help them grow through these traumas. But typically, on the other hand, there's things like, bias and strong defense mechanisms, right? Like Aiden talked about, this idea where we stuff things. There's family expectations, there's secrets, right? That have been passed down on generation upon generation. We don't talk about that, right? So all of this is walking in the room for all of you, no matter what your modality is, whether you're fitness, whether you're hypnosis, whether you're therapy, right? This is all walking in with the individual. And so I talked a little bit about um, how sexual trauma is kind of my focus. And the reason it's my focus is because that's what's walked in the room for me since day one of my first internship, and was, boom, someone who had experienced incest at the hand of her father. And it's like, as a brand new, freshly, not even graduated grad student, I was like, what the hell do I do with this? Right? It was very heady. And a lot of the trauma books talk about going into the trauma, right? And so what I remembered in myself in working with trauma therapists is that that just never felt safe. It made me feel like I had to put stuff out there. I had to re-experience things. I had to, in order to get through it, I had to push through it, you know? And that's not necessarily true. And so in these examples of sexual trauma, right, that I talked about before, is that within each of these areas, there's a long history. There is ancestors, there is beliefs, there is values, there is all of the person, right? And so as Aiden talked about earlier too, is that each person is unique. There's no one solution. So we have all these lovely modalities in therapy, right? And our top-down approaches are things like CBT, EFT, solution focus, psychodynamic, where there's a lot of talking going on in the room. And then we have our bottom-up approaches, which are our EMDR, our dance movement therapy, sensory motor. And then in the middle somewhere, we have IFS, because it kind of taps into both worlds, where we talk about it, but we also feel it. And the goals are different, right? With top down, we're helping them to think differently. With bottom up, we're helping them to identify raw emotion and their defense reactions in order to make changes in how they respond to these triggers, right? So both are beautiful, both are required. I think that I love it when I get a client to a point where their nervous system is sitting in this space of regulation. I'm like, okay, now you got to go work with a solution focused person and get your goals going, because that's not what I'm going to do with you, right? So that's kind of how, also I work with EMDR therapists who have clients who they don't feel are quite ready to go into that brain space or go into the trauma. And so I do a lot of work of identifying where the person sits in their pattern of PTSD. Are they in fight? Are they in flight? Are they in freeze? Or are they in fawn? Fawn is something that shows up a lot in sexual trauma victims. They're people pleasing, they avoid conflict, they want to do good, they want to do everything you give them to do. They're going to show up, but deep down inside, they're letting everybody and everything take away their safety, right? They're living essentially in a space of unsafety. They don't understand the difference between what's okay and what's not okay, how to say no, right? So when I work with a client, and I'm going to go through these really fast because I don't need to get into the details, but the first phase is really to just identify the client's window of tolerance, right? Up here we have hyperactivation, down here we have hypo. Hyper is a tendency towards anxiety, hypo is a tendency towards collapse or depression. We like people to live in between the two, right? But typically the trauma body spikes and collapses, spikes and collapses, spikes and collapses. Or sometimes they stay on here, sometimes they stay up here. But in order to know if someone has complex PTSD or layered trauma, which is like this little bundle of trauma memory like this, and is ready to go into a more in-depth explorative experience with their trauma, we need to understand that they can tolerate it, right? That they're not going to walk out of a session of EMDR and have a collapse. I had that happen. And I had 3 clients, back to back coming up, and I could barely breathe, right? And so in order to make sure that that happens, I work with people, from the outside in. I don't start inside and go out, right? From the edges to the the periphery to the internal. I don't go immediately into, let's do some deep belly breathing. You want to know why? Because typically sexual trauma victims have held their breath during their experience because that's kept them safe. And now you're going to immediately try to take that away from them. That's not giving them a choice. That's not giving them control. That's essentially putting them in that same situation again, right? So I really talk about, how would this feel to you right now? What comes up when I ask you to do this? Can you touch your belly? Does it feel okay to hold your belly? Right? We work really, really slow. And then we're always orienting and grounding. And like, the slowness and orienting and grounding is so vastly important. Because why? Because once again, we go back to our trauma bundle. We start peeling away and talking about the trauma, and you open up one little leaf, and guess what's underneath that? Another little leaf. And then there's that repressed memory down there in that little hole there that they've forgotten about, that gets exposed and goes boom, right? So one of the things in working with these types of individuals is I really make sure that we go super slow. Then the second phase, I bring them back into their bodies. I bring them to touch. I bring them to gross motor movement, not fine motor movement, just really big kind of expansive kind of movement. We start introducing diaphragmatic breath as long as I can tell that their window of tolerance is pretty well established, right? And that's when we get into that vagus nerve and that yumminess of kind of being able to bring people down, right? We practice going in and out of good feelings and bad feelings. And then we start seeing what's held in our body through body scans and guided meditations, right? So when I used to work at Sober Living by the Sea and work with addicts, they're so disconnected from their body. We'd spend the whole hour just like touching the edges of our hands to things. Like, what does that feel like? What do you notice when you push, right? To drop somebody into a body super quickly and have them do some sort of physical shaking and exercise, especially when there's such disassociation, can be very, very activating, right? So that's why we go slow, and then we slow to connect. And then the third phase is what I call the fun stuff, where we bring in music, where we bring in guided meditations, art therapy, vocal practices. We go, woo, we start getting into our throat chakras, we start getting into our bellies, we start getting into the places that feel yummy inside of us. I tell people to start doing yoga and meditation and all these ancillary practices so that they can start experiencing what it's like to be in their bodies in other places besides just the therapy room. And then we talk about those when they come in. And then lastly, for my sexual trauma clients, I am working on an integration to aliveness through the eros, right? And I consider eros to be this place of creativity. We're not just talking about sex here. We're talking about the space where you live, where your creativity lives, where your emotion lives, where, your connection to other lives, right? And through the exploration of things like the vulva and how the body responds to sensual movement, we create these rituals and these practices that I encourage women to do on a regular daily basis, right? And then we take the integrations of those practices and we start to see what it's like to bring that out into the world. What it's like to show up as that integrated whole person who's alive, who's well, who feels yummy, right? That flow. And so how I collaborate with other healers and practitioners, I just refer the shit out of people. Like, I do an in-depth intake when I have clients call me, and I turn more people away than I take on. because I only want to work with a specific niche right now. And I don't want to waste someone's time if they're expecting, well, I had a car accident and I need to reset that. Well, I'm going to send you to an EMDR person because that's just not my thing. I'm going to send you to a somatic experiencing practitioner if you've got specific trauma that you've never released and you have a really good stable nervous system, right? I'm going to send you to an acupuncturist or a hypnosis person if, subconscious material indicates that, you need to kind of work with something that's you've touched into with me, but you're ready to explore it in a different way. But one of the things that I do caveat that with is that I require all that I collaborate with be trauma informed, right? And because of my own experiences and because of some of the things that I've gone through, it's really super important to me that I make sure that the circle that I refer to is in some way informed in that way, right? And there are classes and things to take out there. And lastly, I'm going to be holding my first somatic erotic workshop, and I'm inviting the healers to apply. Unfortunately, Aiden, it is a vulva practice, so you are going to have to be excluded even if you wanted to apply. We will do it via Zoom, and it is I will have an interview process so that I can make sure that everybody is in a safe space, not only for themselves but for the rest of the group, right? So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Wow, that was incredible.
That really was.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. If
So I actually have a question that I meant to ask Dr. Seraphim and then also Deanna. If I had someone on the East Coast that wanted to see y'all for like an intensive, is that something that you would do? And do you have like a ballpark idea of how long they would need to commit to staying? Because I could just see someone, they're like, I need to get through a lot of this stuff. And if they knew they could knock it out in like 2 weeks working with you guys, I think, especially in combination. But do you think that's like for you, Deanna, is that too much for a client? And then Dr. Aiden, you wouldn't mind answering to just how comfortable you would feel doing kind of an intensive where someone would be flying out and staying in a hotel, that kind of stuff. Because you're
so for me, let me just speak to being a licensed therapist. I'm under restrictions to work with people. How I envision doing things with people in an intensive process is through kind of workshop related programs. But for me and the work that I do, typically it takes 3 to 6 months of not only work in yourself, but also work on your own. I mean, work with me, also work on your own. Just with the level of PTSD that I work with.
That's amazing. That's still, 3 to 6 months, pretty amazing.
I once had a client, it was so funny, I had to tell this story. She incest survivor, diagnosed bipolar 2, on a ton of meds, lived in a little kind of bubble. And as we did work, about the 4th month mark, she came in and she looked at and sat down and she's like, "You got a new couch?" I'm like, "No, I didn't. It's been the same couch you've been sitting on."
She noticed.
She finally noticed, right?
That's
that tells you how powerful our nervous system is and kind of collapsing our world,
Yeah. That's amazing.
So I'll let Dr. Aiden speak to, I don't know about the intensive for him.
Oh, I was just trying to type you an answer, but because I didn't want to interrupt your question and answer time. So because we have a little bit of time, so I'll just type you an answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Deanna? We have a few minutes.
I know a lot of what Deanna does because we're friends, but this was even so helpful for me because, when we're in grad school, we don't get enough information on really how to work with these, in depth, right? So I think what really stood out for me, and even though I consider myself trauma informed and I'm trying to get more educated about the body connections and stuff, is the reminder to really slow down. But I love today was working from the outside in and not going too fast and going straight to breath, because so much of kind of general knowledge working with trauma clients is to build the tools, get them grounded, giving them all those things. But when you have someone that's so traumatized like that, like I am working with a client now and I'm thinking about her the whole time you're talking, I'm like, oh, did that too fast, I'm like thinking about that. So that was really helpful. So thank you for sharing that, because it just gives me a different lens to look at it now. So
yeah. You're welcome.
Michelle just mentioned it, but I was wondering, what is trauma informed?
So there's
therapists in this group, and I'm not one of them. So
yeah. So there are programs that are. Some people label themselves as trauma informed, and some people label themselves as trauma trained. I consider myself trauma trained because I've had extensive background in working with PTSD clients through most of the agency practices that I've worked in. I've worked under individuals who are trauma specialists. Trauma informed means that you're not treating trauma, but that you have an understanding of how trauma affects the body and affects the nervous system and the brain. And you have enough knowledge to know when to refer, right? Have enough knowledge to know how far to go with someone who's maybe presenting or bringing trauma to you, right? So the idea is not that your modality is about completing trauma with that individual, but being savvy enough to know when to bring in the resources, right?
Thank you for spending some of your time today with us at Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. If you like what we're all about, please consider supporting our nonprofit organization by making a tax-deductible donation. To do this, you can go to our website at www.sagewellnessctr.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. We look forward to spending some time again with you real soon. Take good care.